Welcome to another video for SVG support with TMS controls. Today I want to explain to you how to use vectors with a bitmap selector. Bitmap selector, I was a little bit uncertain myself what a bitmap selector was, so let me give you an example right away. The bitmap selector component allows you to display images, as you can see here, in a grid. You can specify the number of columns and the number of rows. And then in this grid, the bitmaps will be aligned. Of course, you can specify the size of the images and if the images should have a caption or not. In addition to this, the bitmap selector also allows you to specify the size for the images. Before vector support, this was not a smooth process. These images all here were bitmaps, and bitmaps don't scale to any resolution. So you had several means to provide images. Either you provided multiple images at certain sizes, 32, 64, 128, and then interpolated or stretched in between. Still, you had pixelation. Now, with SVG support, meaning you use vectors and the framework scales the images for you to an appropriate size, this all is a thing of the past. You provide one vector image and all the resolutions and all the densities of your displays are being taken care of. In this tutorial you will learn how to build this VCL Forms application that you just saw. How do you generate vector icons inside of a bitmap selector? In addition, the demo will have the feature to load SVG images from a folder. So this example not only shows prepared images, you can load your own vector images if you want to. The example makes heavy use of bitmap containers. Bitmap containers are part of the FNC framework, and there is a separate video tutorial for this component. Just in short, bitmap containers allow you to store multiple images that you can identify by name or index. With SVG support, the bitmap container stores one vector image and scales it for any DPI or resolution completely automatically. Even if you move forms between different screens, the component makes sure that you always have the image in the right size without the image being too small or too big. I already mentioned this is a VCL application, so the target platforms are Windows-based. Just as a side note, I could build this inside of FireMonkey as well and target all the other platforms that are available. However, as I already did a FireMonkey video, I also wanted to show that everything works fine in the VCL as well. Let me start by explaining which controls can be found on the form. First, we have an FNC toolbar, which makes it easy to add buttons and other controls to the toolbar. There's a separate tutorial that explains how to build toolbars with the FNC framework. We also have two bitmap containers. One container will be responsible to store or to archive the images that are supposed to be shown inside of the bitmap selector, and the other bitmap container will hold the images for the toolbar. Of course, it's only one image, but for demonstration purposes, you should always put your toolbar images inside of a bitmap container, because if you add buttons later, it makes it so much easier. So as you can see, there is the toolbar container, and I even put a couple of images in there, and I only reference one of the images inside of the toolbar button. So selecting the button, we see that we have a bitmap container set, but we can't find a bitmap name property. Well, toolbars work a little bit different because you specify multiple bitmaps per button. So opening up the bitmaps property, we see that we here have the bitmap, and here we have the reference to the bitmap name. Be aware that you cannot have a look at the bitmap here, because if you specify the bitmap here, the bitmap name would not be used. So either specify a bitmap or a bitmap name for the button. And the reason why you can specify multiple buttons is the scale. And this is from the time where you did not have vector support. You were able to provide different PNG or bitmaps in general for different scales. For now, just leave scale on 1 and provide a vector image. That will take care of everything. You also have a spin edit on the toolbar The spin edit will hold the size of the image to be shown inside of the bitmap selector. Finally, there's a checkbox on the toolbar that allows you to specify if you want to show the names of the images inside of the bitmap container or not. Looking at the bitmap selector component, we see that it is connected to the container that is supposed to take on the images that are supposed to be shown inside of it. Note that the toolbar was connected to the toolbar container. The container, bitmap container, is connected to the bitmap selector. Then there's two very important properties. Number one is column, which defines the amount of columns to use, and rows, which defines the amount of rows to use. We leave the items property alone at runtime. Be aware, in order to have something inside of the bitmap selector from application start, I loaded a couple of SVG vectors into the bitmap container. So even though there are elements inside of the bitmap container, there are no elements inside of the bitmap selector at design time, meaning we have to write source code to fill up the bitmap selector. For that, I wrote a method called updateSelector, and just like with a list view in the VCL or a list box item in the FNC framework, there is a TMS FNC Bitmap Selector item that represents one item inside of the bitmap selector. We will now iterate all the items inside of the container and create TMS FNC Bitmap Selector items for them. We also get the bitmap name from the bitmap container in order to assign it to the bitmap selector item. So we get the bitmap selector item, L-item, using the items.add method of the bitmap selector component. Then we assign the bitmap name to the text in case we checked the show names component. We also align the text at the bottom, not on top of the image. In case we did not check show names, we set the text to nothing. This step might not be necessary, I just wanted to juxtapose from assigning a value to text. Then we set the bitmap name to the bitmap name, and we set the bitmap size to the size that we selected in the spin edit. Finally, one note to begin update and end update. Please always call begin update and end update on the bitmap selector component to make sure that you do not redraw the component for every iteration. This will significantly speed up the process adding items to the selector component. If you forget to call begin update and end update, you'll notice that it takes significantly longer to add items to the control. Finally, at runtime, I changed the number of rows according to the total amount of items inside the bitmap container. I want to make sure that everything is being displayed. On the other hand, I do not define too many rows if there is not many items available. Finally, how do we load the images into the bitmap container? I showed you at design time that every bitmap container has a load files from folder functionality in the context menu of the designer. To make matters very easy, TMS added functionality at runtime for the bitmap container as well. So every bitmap container, as you can see right here, has a method called add from file, add from folder, add from resource, add from URL. And add from folder is exactly what we want to do. We want to add images from a folder with this mask, *.svg. This will make certain that all the SVG files in the directory that we selected in the dialog folder component, which is a T folder dialog from TMS. So we select the folder, and this folder will be used as a source for all the SVG graph. The dialog folder is not very customized here. I just want to make sure that there's no new folder button available, that the new dialog style is being used, and that shareable folders are also being displayed. And then the behavior of this dialog component is simply the same as with any other dialog component that I know in Delphi. You call the execute method, and if execute returns true, then you can be certain that a value has been provided that you can use. Unlike with a file open dialog or file save dialog, you use the directory property in order to get the selected directory. After adding the images to the container component, we also call the update selector method in order to update our graphical user interface. I also make sure that the items that have been inside of the container before are being removed, calling container items.clear. And these few lines of code lead to this wonderful application that you can use to browse folders with SVG graphics. Here you see my example resources. And I downloaded a lot of SVG images. For example, for science, SVG. And it displays all the scientific SVG vector graphics in that folder. I can resize the whole window and you see everything is scaled properly. However, it will never go below 64 pixels. This simple demo application really gives you the opportunity to write a tiny little application to browse your SVG images. This is very useful because Windows does not have any functionality to show SVG vector graphics inside of Windows Explorer. So in order to get a nice grid view of SVG graphics, you can use your own tool that you learned to build in this short tutorial video. Let's look at one more implementation aspect, the size of the graphics. We defined a spin edit, and in the method to build the items, we set the bitmap size to the value of the spin edit. However, we want to make sure that when the user clicks plus and minus, the bitmap selector is actually updated. So we select the event on value changed, and in on value changed we call the update selector method. Let's load some more images, selecting some Cyber Monday icon set. Here we have some very different icons, very colorful, with the topic of Cyber Monday. Again, the default size is 64. However, if we click minus, you might even be able to hear it while I click. The size changes immediately and there is no pixelation whatsoever. Of course, I can also display the names, and this is the functionality of the application. Of course, I'd like to mention one general thing. The bitmap selector, of course, is to be used to actually offer means for a user to select an image. There's events in the bitmap selector component that allow you to find out which image is selected. However, the component is also a wonderful component to show a grid of images easily. As a quick note, there's other tutorials in this SVG series. First of all, have a look how to use bitmap containers. This tutorial gives you more information in detail how to use bitmap containers and what their advantages are. There's another tutorial that teaches you how to build a toolbar with vector images, and finally how to use vector images inside of a list box.